What is the eternal return, and how can we best understand one of the most enigmatic concepts put forward by 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche? In this video, we will examine the concept of the eternal return, along with two basic interpretive approaches used to understand it and some nuanced views of Nietzsche's difficult, ambiguous, and transformative insight. But before we get going, please like and subscribe to Left Hand for more philosophical meditations. One popularized expression of the eternal return you may have encountered is that time is a flat circle. Everything that has happened in the history of the cosmos will, at some point, happen again. Given infinite time, finite matter and energy, and the unchanging laws of physics, it is the case that the totality of past events, the present moment, and all future phenomena will eventually cycle back, returning again and again to a series of familiar states. However, a question lingers as to whether Nietzsche intended the concept of the eternal return as a bona fide metaphysical doctrine. Or was it rather meant simply as a psychological provocation, a thought experiment meant to transform how one lives or thinks? One of the claims that I want to put forward here is that no matter Nietzsche's intention, thinking the eternal return arouses within thought itself affordances that support a number of interpretations, making the concept irreducible to any single metaphysical dogma. So let's get some context first. In 1881, while living in Sils Maria, where he composed many of his most influential works, Nietzsche is said to have undergone a profound psychological episode during one of his regular walks near Lake Silvaplana. At this pivotal moment, Nietzsche claimed to have had a revelation, the thought of the eternal return. In subsequent works, namely in The Gay Science and later in his mythopoetic masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates his epiphany in various ways. In The Gay Science, we observe perhaps the most firm and direct articulation in the famous aphorism, "The greatest weight." Nietzsche writes, "What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, 'This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees and even this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke this? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, 'You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine'? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more, and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate, eternal confirmation and seal? Nietzsche's provocation in The Gay Science is often seen as a pivotal moment in the history of philosophy and a crucial antecedent to the existentialist themes later explored by figures such as Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. But what was Nietzsche's purpose in this aphorism? Before considering the actual content of The Greatest Weight, it is important to reflect on Nietzsche's aphoristic style as his preferred method of philosophical meditation. For Nietzsche, the aphorism was not meant to convey an immutable truth. It is a rhetorical object deployed to engage a particular reader and evoke a thought or action specific to that reader's sensibilities and contingent situation. As for The Greatest Weight, Nietzsche implores his readers to consider the burden foisted upon them with the death of God. In the absence of divine providence and moral mediation, the human being is left exposed to the vastness of the cosmos, deprived of ultimate meaning. What's lost is everything the Godhead once guaranteed: the promise of redemption, compensation for earthly suffering, and, in our weakest moments, a power that could act on our behalf. Everything is returned to us, the human being. Nietzsche scholar David Allison writes that the eternal return infinitizes humanity. With no deity presiding over the cosmos, the human being is subjected to a cold and radical liberation. The human is confronted not only with every unrealized possibility, but also with the prospect of reliving again and again every moment already realized. The challenge Nietzsche puts forward is whether we can affirm all those moments in their successive iterations for the rest of time. Now, I imagine that at least some of you listening or watching are already familiar with this part of the story. However, one of the primary reasons I've made this video is to drill down into the metaphysical presuppositions implicit in Nietzsche's formulation of the eternal return. Some believe the eternal return was simply an image or metaphor meant to instigate an ethical response in the reader. However, in many of the meditations on the eternal return found in Nietzsche's unpublished writings, he considers how we might ground a scientific understanding of the concept. One of the central problems with approaching the eternal return as a scientific hypothesis or a literal claim about reality is the impossibility of verifying its core premise. In fact, one could argue that Nietzsche introduces the eternal return precisely to trouble the very foundations of truth and knowledge that have shaped the history of Western thought. However, perhaps the eternal return's most important and enduring effect is to unmoor thought from its moralized form, one in which the immortality of the soul takes precedence over the immediacy of life and the body. Regardless, at some level, Nietzsche was intent on exploring its deeper metaphysical implications and how the eternal return might wholly encompass experience and reality. Now, a common reading of the eternal return is what we might call the eternal return of the same. That is, given the rule-bound nature of physical reality and the finite permutations of matter and energy across infinite time, it is conceivable that all previous and existing configurations and discrete entities in the universe will eventually recur, not just once, but an infinite number of times. More specifically, what returns is the same, meaning that the person you are now will, at some point along time's infinite arc, be reconstituted exactly as you are, embedded in the very same contingent circumstances you occupy at this moment. This version of the eternal return often implies a strong view of personal identity, that is, you as you are presently recognized or as circumscribed by the conditions of identity in this reality. By extension, if one believes that consciousness or mental attributes supervene on the specific physical configuration of atoms and molecules composing the brain, spinal cord, and possibly more, and if it were the case that this aggregate of consciousness or mental attributes is you, then it follows that you, exactly as you are now, would reappear identically in subsequent iterations along an infinite chronological timeline. A potential problem with this argument lies in its fundamental presupposition that your identity, the you in question, remains intact through a perfect conservation of energy and matter along a continuous timeline, with no allowance for entropy or disorder. But setting aside those complex physical assumptions, there is a more prominent issue here. As David Allison notes, for the strong view of personal identity to hold, it would have to qualify the very identity of the person who maintained it. In other words, any version of you in a future recurrence would have to forget having lived before, or else it would not truly be the same you. This forgetting, however, implies a break in continuity, essentially a different subject altogether, which undermines the idea of a literal return. That said, this critique does not necessarily diminish the power of the eternal return as a metaphor or an image or a thought experiment. But there is another view of the eternal return offered by various interpreters of Nietzsche in which the same that returns is not an endless cycle of repetition, but where what is the same is the ongoing process of differential interactions. Here, the shift is ontological in scope. It's not about discrete things or events per se, but about the eternal return as a dynamical flux of the same cosmic forces constantly producing new combinations of energy and matter. While this view may lend itself to a system with a stronger metaphysical consistency, one might claim that it drains the thought of the eternal return of its psychological force and import, not to mention all of its poetic juice, well, at least in the way that we see it in the gay science. On its face, considering the eternal return as a principle behind the play of cosmic forces doesn't carry the same weight as the crisis provoked by imagining your life exactly as it is now, repeating again and again. For some, this contrast may vindicate the more psychological interpretation of the eternal return, perhaps at the expense of a metaphysical or scientific reading. 20th century French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, however, offers a striking reconceptualization of the eternal return that seeks to overcome this disjunction. Deleuze attempts to elaborate the ontological nuance of differential processes as the return of the same, without sacrificing the transformative ethical force evinced in Nietzsche's original formulation. The eternal return is not the return of identical arrangements. In fact, Deleuze says it's the opposite of this. In a previous discussion of mine, Nietzsche scholar Devin Garay and I hash out the details at length in a video which appears on the screen right now, and which you can find in the show notes below. But let's, on our own, attempt a summary of Deleuze's view here. At base, Deleuze believes that becoming is the essence of the eternal return, not in the sense of becoming a specific or discrete entity, but as a continuous differential process through which forces enter new domains of thought and action. It also entails the affirmation of differences that emerge along the way. Affirmation means to embrace the perpetual cosmic throw of the dice, to welcome both chance and necessity in their generation of new differences, and to allow ourselves to be transformed by events. The conservation of identity, or the self-identical, demands that we say no to difference, which for Deleuze is the lowest degree of power. The notion of the eternal return of the same, where the same is understood as the identical, forecloses the transmutation of forces and denies the dynamic destabilization of fixed ontology. So this is to say that the eternal return is not only an ethical thought or a psychological provocation, it is also an ontological test. For Deleuze, only that which can return, only that which affirms becoming and endures the selection of the eternal return, enters into the fullness of existence and goes to the limit of what it can do. But how might Deleuze's metaphysics translate into psychological terms, especially given that Nietzsche's aphorism seems intended to provoke a psychological rupture or intervention in the reader? At some level, isn't Deleuze betraying Nietzsche with his interpretation? Much like Nietzsche's aphoristic style and the concept of the eternal return itself, Nietzsche's work seeks to instigate new modes of thinking, rather than simply assert that his ideas be faithfully represented. While Deleuze's recasting of the eternal return may not, for some, resonate with the quote-unquote real Nietzsche, the very notion that such a Nietzsche exists within the text runs counter to Nietzsche's own philosophical vision, one in which thought is liberated from the will to truth and returned to creativity. For Deleuze, we might say that the artistry of thought, like any artistic form, demands both fidelity and novelty in the act of invention. As creators of concepts, we draw inspiration from existing ideas while also transfiguring them. These concepts remain decomposable, available to be reassembled into new formations. And though a genealogy of thought can be traced, the new concept is never reducible to its predecessors. As Deleuze and Guattari ask in What is Philosophy, What is the best way to follow the great philosophers? Is it to repeat what they said, or to do what they did? That is, create concepts for problems that necessarily change. In this light, Deleuze's true homage to Nietzsche lies not in repetition, but in creation. Furthermore, Deleuze's concept of the eternal return actualizes its own ethical predicates by refusing to remain bound to the image of the self-identical found in Nietzsche's initial formulation. His transposition of identity and difference, along with his transformation of metaphor into concept, emerges from the very differential processes he locates at the heart of active thought. Now, of course, this raises the question of what creative addition I might offer to the philosophical register and what was intended as a survey or summary of the eternal return. Admittedly, perhaps I'm merely bringing the stars down to earth in this short video, but I do believe I can offer a modest contribution, one that gestures towards the spirit of thought as creation rather than mere commentary. And I will do so by firming up a connection between some of the mythological precedents of Nietzsche's work in general and Deleuze's conceptual creativity. In various places throughout his work, Deleuze explores the myth of Theseus and Ariadne to illuminate a contrast between images that we might also conceive as forms of life or forms of living. In the traditional telling of the myth, Theseus is a hero who enters the labyrinth to slay the Minotaur, a monstrous creature imprisoned at its center. He succeeds with the help of Ariadne, who gives him a thread to trace his way back, an image often read as a metaphor for guidance through chaos or complexity. After his triumph, however, Theseus abandons Ariadne on the island of Naxos, introducing themes of betrayal, detachment, and the severing of relational bonds. In the tale, Theseus embodies the role of the hero, one encumbered with the task of facing off with the malign monster of Crete, the Minotaur. The heroic mode of existence and heroic values, particularly in the case of Theseus, are defined by encumbrance and opposition. Theseus binds himself to a deathly task, one that unfolds within the constrained corridors of the labyrinth, a bounded arena where the monster resides. The ordeal carries the pretense of affirmation, a noble pursuit for so-called higher men, but for Deleuze, it is a travesty. The murder and the burden of carrying it out is steeped in the same moralizing impulses that Nietzsche so vehemently critiques. Ariadne's presence further compounds this image of negation and opposition. Her act of lowering Theseus into the labyrinth, guiding him with a thread, only reinforces the dialectical structure of heroic values that Deleuze seeks to dismantle. And then it happens. Following Theseus's conquest of the beast, he abandons Ariadne, with whom he had shared the burden of negativity. For Deleuze, this break, and the turning of the negative upon itself, its severing itself from reactive forces, heralds a transmutation and, of course, the return of difference. What's more, depending on which version of the myth one takes as canonical, Ariadne is left sleeping on the island of Naxos after her abandonment, only to awaken and encounter her new consort, Dionysus. I take this moment of lapse to be essential in illustrating the ontological and ethical turning of the negative upon itself. I call this moment Naxosis. And while I imagine the concept of Naxosis to extend beyond purely psychological application, it offers a lens through which we can understand the nature of transformation that occurs when we are released from the grip of reactive forces. For my part, the experience of the eternal return is naxotic. It is a lapse in the carrying of our own burdens that opens the possibility not only to new ways of thinking, but to new forms of life. But more about that another time. If you enjoyed this installment of Left Hand, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. You can get new essays, videos, monologues, and more early if you subscribe at the $5 level or more. In the meantime, please continue exploring the Left Hand channel for more discussions of the crossroads where philosophy, politics, and psychology meet. Take care.